The garden is the perfect place to observe how different traits are passed down from parent generations to their offspring, or F1, first filial generation. Plants reproduce quickly. They reproduce a lot of seeds, a lot of offspring, and while you can cross-pollinate them between two separate plants, you can also self-pollinate certain plants that are monoecious, that have both male and female characteristics, to be able to isolate certain traits. So Mendel wasn't the first person to actually observe that traits from one parent, if you save the seed, can be passed on to the next generation. But he was the first to really look at very intentional crosses and make very detailed notes about those observations and begin to explain a little bit about how certain patterns that he observed could help us predict the different types of inheritance of these traits, the passing on from one to the next. So in his experiment, he looked at a lot of different traits, from pod and seed color and flower color to shape and size and whether a seed is wrinkly or smooth. We're going to look at one trait at a time. We're going to call that a monohybrid cross. But keep in mind that these rules apply to all of the different traits. And these actual physical traits that we can see, like the color of these flowers or these pea pods, is a plant's phenotype. Or any organism. We use the same laws apply to animals. Those are the phenotype. And then the genotype are the alleles that we'll be talking about. So what the genetic pairs, the one you get from mom and the one you get from dad, that then create this particular phenotype. So let's do a cross. Let's take, here's a white flowering one. Let's just look at one trait. And let's cross it with a purple one. And in this case, it's got white flowers, it's tall, it's green. Let's do a similar parent over here, but we're going to really just focus on color for now, that one particular trait. And let's say that that trait is represented by the allele with the letter C. So let's cross and let's see what the resulting offspring might look like. Okay, so we've got purple and we've got white. Looks like they've got all very similar characteristics otherwise. And so here's my parent generation and here's my F1 generation. Now in a pea plant, that's all the seeds that, that flower produced. So you could have many, many different kinds. We might look at actual numbers, but we can also talk about percentages. So it looks like, a little less than half had purple flowers and a little more than half had white flowers, which might lead us to believe that there is a dominant trait. And let's see if that's true. Let's cross a white one. Actually, let's try purple. Let's cross. So here's the offspring. This is the F1 generation. So now we're going to cross them to make the F2 generation. Let's cross two purple peas. Now, we could assume that this would always produce purple flowers because I only see purple flowers in the parent generation. Let's see what happens. That's interesting. So it looks like we actually ended up with some purple and some white flowers. Let's try another cross. So here's the F3 generation. Let's cross two other offspring again. And let's see what we end up with. So we're seeing more purple flowers than we're seeing white flowers. How does that happen? Let's try crossing a white one and a purple one and see what we get. I would expect to see probably same percentage. Okay. And let's do that same cross again with that next generation. So the F1, the F2, the F3 generation. And what happens if we cross that plant with itself? So I'm going to cross a purple plant with itself, and you'd expect to see the same traits. And for the most part, I got that. I wonder if I do that again with this one with certain traits. Wow, so even if I crossed a plant with itself, I might end up with a white flower. So let's talk a little bit about this experiment and some of these observations and talk about what this sort of led us to understand about the laws of inheritance. If we've got a plant that has a fairly dominant trait, so we tended to see in that case the purple more than the white. Let's have that represented with a certain letter. We're going to use C, but big C and little c look a lot alike. So let's use R for color. So let's say that purple flowers are represented by a big R and white flowers are represented by a little r. And let's say that in a long-term observation that Mendel tended to see that when he crossed a white pea and a purple pea together, about 75% of the offspring were purple. So we call that dominant trait, right? We call it the dominant trait, whereas the R, little r, the white flower, is the recessive trait. Now, because you get one bit of information from mom and one bit of information from dad, we always talk about them in pairs, or what we call alleles. So a plant that had a big R from mom and a big R from dad would end up producing a genotype that looked like this, and this is called a homozygous dominant trait because both are the same. They're both dominant and they're both big R. But a plant that has the dominant trait from mom, that might be purple, and the recessive trait from dad could have a genotype that looks like this, and we call this the heterozygous. And in this case, even though the genotype, right, the genotype that we're talking about is big R, little r, which is genotype, is heterozygous. The actual phenotype, right, the phenotype, so what we actually see would still be purple because you have the big R in that combination. So let's take a look at what happens in what we call a monohybrid cross. And the term we give, what I'm drawing here, is called the Punnett Square. And we can use this. This applies for any set of alleles in any organism. So it could be fur color in a mouse or flower color in a plant. And let's say in this case we have a white flowering pea plant. We'll put mom up here. So we know that her genotype has to be little r, because the only way that she can have white flowers in her phenotype is if she has both the recessive. Because let's assume dad is purple flowered. He might carry the gene here from his parent generation of white flowers, but he's going to look like a purple plant because he has that dominant trait. Well, let's say that these two plants get together, they fall in love. Let's do a Punnett square together. I'm going to pull the big R over here, big R, and bring down the little r over here. We always actually write the dominant trait first, even no matter which direction we pull. It's just kind of how we annotate it. So again, I'm going to pull over the big R, and I'm going to pull down the little r. So here's my mom and here's my dad, and what I'm creating down here in my Punnett square is the F1 generation, the offspring. So this is my little r, and I pull my little r over from here. And same thing, I've got my little r from mom and also my little r from dad. So what I've created in this F1 generation, and we'll just refer to these as a percentage, right? Because this might be, in a pea plant, this might be 100 seeds are produced as a result of this cross. So this tells me that my genotype, right? The genotype is, I've got half of my genotype up here as heterozygous, and half of my genotype down here is homozygous for the recessive. And my phenotype would mean that 50% of my plants, right, these two, are going to look purple, and 50% of my plants are going to look white. So this F1 generation would create half white and half purple flowers. Let's say this F1 generation gets bred together. Let's breed one of them to themselves, because we can do that in a plant. That's not weird or creepy at all. So let's take one of those offspring, and their genotype is the heterozygous. What color are these two? What is it going to be? It's going to be a purple plant, right? Because it's got the dominant trait, the big R. But let's breed them together. Let's bring that R and that R, so the dominant trait down. And I've just created 25% chance, likelihood, right, that I would have a dominant homozygous, so a purple pea flower. What about over here? Bring this R over and this R down. And I'm going to produce a genotype very similar to both mom and dad, which would then have the same phenotype as being purple. I'm going to bring my big R down here and my little r down here. Remember, it doesn't matter if you put mom or dad first, we always write whatever the dominant trait is first. And then little r and little r. So it looks like even if I took a purple flowering plant right from that first cross and bred it to itself, so similar, mom and dad are the same, similar genetic information, even though they were both purple plants, 25% of the time I could have a white flowering pea plant because that gene is carried throughout. So if I wanted to get a pea plant 100% of the time that was white, I would have to cross, either self-pollinate or find two white pea plants, right? If this was a little r and this was a little r. that would result in 100% of the time a white flowering pea plant, or I'd have to be very creative with, let's see if I'd use a dominant purple, whoops, and crossed it. So here's a purple flower that has the phenotype of purple, and it is a homozygous, and then I crossed it with the white homozygous recessive. What would I end up with? Well, I take my big R, my little r, and put it here. Same thing here, bring that R down, that R over. Same thing, I always write the dominant trait, the big R first. So even though I have now 100% homozygous, right, I'm going to have 100% purple plant because, again, that R is the dominant trait. So that allows us to make predictions about the offspring based on a particular trait. Now what we've done is a monohybrid cross, meaning we've looked at just one specific allele, in this case color, but we can look at all different kinds of traits like height, like pea color, and this is true also in other animals. So we have the ability to look at crosses when we're making purposeful crosses through cross-pollination. If we can use a little Q-tip or a paintbrush, or sometimes growers will take the male flower and actually bring it over to the female flower of another, and then sometimes close it off, like with using like a breathable bag, or even gluing the flowers shut, so that matures into the next generation. The seeds inside, as the ovary swells, if this is a fruit, for example, the seeds inside will contain that purposeful cross and could result in a very favorable hybrid that you are now able to market.